Good evening. This evening, as you can see on the screen, our topic will be the resurrection. And this is part one of what will be a couple of parts. If you are familiar with the story, you'll know that following the resurrection, that Jesus appeared to several different folks, several different places. But we're not really going to talk about any of that tonight. That'll be the next one. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the act, if you would say that way, of the resurrection. And so we'll talk about this evening. Next Sunday evening, Kevin, I think it's the first Sunday evening of July, and we have singing night. Kevin and I have been confused all week as to whether or not what day and what month it actually is. So it'll be in 2 Sundays that we'll pick this back up, but that we'll continue with this. But the last couple of days that we've been studying on this, we had talked about the crucifixion. And 2 weeks ago, we discussed the crucifixion, sort of the act of crucifixion. And then last week, you may remember that we talked about strange happenings during the crucifixion in and around the community there in Jerusalem. And so tonight, we'll talk about the resurrection. It's important to note regarding the resurrection that all four, the Gospels will speak about the resurrection, and you get sort of different versions or tellings of what it is. And we will be sort of all over the place tonight when we talk about that. So we'll discuss each of these sort of in part as we go. But just as a introduction here, the reading that we chose, the reading that Ben gave, was from 1 Corinthians, and Paul was writing to Corinth. And essentially, Paul is giving a defense for what his job is. Paul's going out to preach, and he's saying that our faith is founded upon the resurrection of Jesus. And he says if there's no resurrection, then the word that Ben read there, that his work was futile, that it was futile. That essentially what he's saying is, without a resurrection, I'm just walking around talking to people, and anybody can do that. But he said that would be the basis of it. At this point, even though we talked last week about strange occurrences that had happened, really the last week of Jesus's life had been a lot like a lot of other people's last week of life. Jesus had been put on trial, and he certainly wasn't the only person that had been tried. The Jews had tried other people for religious reasons. The Romans had tried people. Jesus had been taken to the cross. He had to carry his cross. He wasn't the first person to have done that. He had been crucified on the cross. And we saw last week or 2 weeks ago, there were 2 people right beside him that had experienced the exact same thing that he had. But what will be different is what we're going to talk about this evening. Because for most people, after that crucifixion, after that death, that was the end of the line. This will be a bit different. And so we're talking about the resurrection. Jesus had said, and we talked about this a couple of times, but almost at the beginning, it's in John chapter 2, and John's a little different than the other 3, but even still, that's way early in his ministry, that he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. Like I said, we've talked about this before. Most people in hearing that interpreted him to be talking about what? The temple, the physical temple in Jerusalem. And the temple in Jerusalem that they had labored over for years, almost 50 years, I think, the one that they were working on right then. But it was impractical to think. If you go home tonight and tear your house down, you can't build it up in 3 days. Even if you live in a 1-room shed, it's going to be impossible to build that up. But they heard this, and the thought was, that's impractical that you would be able to do this. But Jesus, of course, is not talking about the temple, But that probably tells you a good bit about how important the temple was in the lives of people, that was the center of it. But he had mentioned that earlier. And of course, we're going to be looking tonight at the resurrection, which would encompass those 3 days as well. But the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is what we said a moment ago, the foundation of faith right there. Our assurance that he is the Son of God. Now, let's start first by talking about, I've titled this, there's 2 slides, Removing Jesus. But there's a practical sense that if somebody is placed on a cross, they have to be removed as well. And these are things that we maybe don't want to think about, but they are things that actually happen. So normally the Romans left bodies of crucified victims hanging upon the cross until they rotted, until they were devoured by animals, which is a sort of gross thing to consider. But why do you think it was done in that way? Deterrence. There's very rarely has that ever worked in history, that you do things like that to deter people from actually committing crimes. But that's one reason, is be a deterrence. Why else might they have done it? Maybe. Huh? I think that's what probably as much as anything is that you've got people, these soldiers have work to do. And this person's hung up here, he's dead, he ain't doing nothing. It serves as a deterrent. We don't have to worry about it. We're not going to bury this person. They're a criminal, whatever it would be. But the Jewish law, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, that Jewish law and Roman law were not the same. There was a conflict between the two. And it was against Jewish law for a body to hang overnight. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, you can see that. And so this is an interesting thought. Who was behind Jesus's crucifixion? The Jewish priests, the high priests, the scribes, the Pharisees. They were the ones that were behind it. But Jesus was a Jew. Jesus's friends were predominantly Jewish. And so the people that will be concerned about Jesus would have not wanted him to have been in violation of this Jewish law. And so this idea of leaving him hanging was a violation of Jewish law. In addition, the day Jesus is crucified was Friday, called preparation, as it's the day before the Sabbath. And we talked a bit about the Sabbath day in the past as well. They were limited as to what they would be allowed to do on the Sabbath day. And so just like any typical Sabbath day, the day before was spent, we use the word preparation, the day before was spent getting all the hard work done so you didn't have to do it on the next day. Well, Jesus hanging on Friday could not be taken down on Saturday, was illegal in Jewish law to be hanging overnight. It kind of ties the hands of the Jewish people. What do they have to do for Jesus right then? They're going to have to remove him from there. Now, most of these Roman executions appear to be done to people who were bad people. These were criminals of sort of the highest level. I don't know how many people were waiting on the body of the 2 thieves that were hanging beside Jesus. But Jesus was a special case in that he hadn't done anything wrong, and he has a sizable following of people that are there with him. So you would have had people that would have desired to take Jesus down, to have buried him in a proper way, to have placed him somewhere safe or whatever it might would be. So you have this kind of conflict here between the two. And so, yeah. I'm saying more than anything, like the way that people, when they executed people, I don't know that there were always people at the foot of the cross waiting for those people to be taken out and buried here or there. We don't really know what would be one way or the other. And so the Jewish people, and we'll see this tonight, they seek Pilate's permission to remove the bodies of Jesus and the 2 others before their Sabbath day, which will begin at sunset. And so that sets the stage a bit for what we are going to be looking at. But as we talked about with crucifixion, wasn't any guarantee that the person on the cross was going to be dead just like that. In fact, we talked last week, what was one thing that or 2 weeks ago, what was one thing that they would sometimes do to sort of hurry up the job? They would break their legs, and that shock and that pain, which they were already near death, that would sometimes finish the job. So you're kind of stuck in a spot where if the person is still alive, they're not going to let you take them down off the cross. Why would they not want you to take a living person off the cross? He might survive. You know, he could live. You could live through that, and then you've lost all of your, your power as the leader or whatever. And so they're going to go and look at him right here. And we can see here, to hasten the deaths of Jesus and the two others, Pilate directs the soldiers to break their legs. We read here, normally crucifixion would have resulted in a slow death, but breaking the legs would speed that up just a little bit. Now, I was thinking about this as we're getting ready, and I'm going to ask you this, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. But if you were hanging on the cross, do you think you would want them to break your legs? Do you remember the question that's asked of Solomon with the baby, and he says, cut the baby? And it feels like there's no good answer to this question. But I was thinking about it. If you hang there long enough, you're still alive, but you're dying. But if they come and break your legs, that's going to hurt really, really bad. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer, but I threw that out there because I wanted to see, and it sounded like it's 50-50. Some of y'all was like, hang forever, and the rest of you like, break those legs. We got a little bit of both right there. It's interesting. I think that's a psychological thing, how people think about things like that. But when the soldiers will come to Jesus, they'll see that he's already dead. So there's no need to break his legs. You're just doubling up on something. You're wasting time in that case. But one of the soldiers will pierce his side with a spear, and I've got an artistic rendering of that right here. Both of those things will fulfill the scriptures. In Psalm chapter 30 and verse 20, he guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. And then Zechariah 12 and 10, then they will look on me whom they pierce. So we see both of those things right there. So go ahead. Then I will say there's quite a bit of lead in, and then we've also got some scripture, so it's possible you may have questions that we're going to address a little later, but go ahead. Right. Go ahead. Repeat that again, Josh. I'm sorry.
Well, there's difference between Roman law and Jewish law. Romans don't care how long it takes you to hang there and die, 2 days, 3 days.
Right.
So the Jews must have had a lot of influence, though, to pursue this and say, come on, let's speed this up.
Well, I think we've seen in the last few weeks that the Jews, in some ways, had sort of an undue influence on Pilate. We've talked, though, before that the main job of Pilate, as assigned by Rome, was to keep the peace in the community. And I don't know if influence is the right word, but if this helps to keep the peace, then maybe so. It might have been that other criminals were coming to ask for the other criminals, and that's probably not good. But we've seen Pilate was reluctant to punish Jesus because it seems as though Pilate could not find anything that he had done wrong. But Pilate also does not sort of, drop the fist and say, no, we're not going to do this either. So influence, I don't know how to perfectly answer that, but clearly there's some influence there between the two.
I think the fact that they could have even easier than breaking the legs, just put a spear in everybody's side.
Sure.
But that would have been too merciful. And that goes to show, the true intent here is just create as much misery, pain,
Sure.
and concern as possible.
Sure.
Because you see somebody getting stabbed in the side, okay, but you see them getting a big war hammer.
Yeah.
Bone sticking out. That's going to leave an impression on you. That's not something you're ever going to do.
When I was thinking about this, I think about I don't know the image, and it didn't exist, I guess, at the time, but a crowbar. And I think about growing up, the crowbar that Dad had, and it was black, but it kind of looked rough. And that's I can see it. I guess he probably still has it, but I can still see it. And I, like that across the knee or across the shin or where I don't know what leg necessarily meant right there, but no good answer right there. And I think you would be right with that. Sure. 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 Well, little hard to see, but there's clearly blood spattered at the bottom of this cross right here. I think that's what we talked about, that they took the executions took place outside of the city gates. This was not something that you wanted in your backyard. This was away, out and away, or what have you. So we're going to talk about with this a couple of men that will play a role in Jesus's burial. To start with, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. To this point, Joseph of Arimathea is a name that's not going to be familiar to you if you've just been reading the Bible straight through. This is when we'll first see him. However, Nicodemus is not a new name to you. We've seen Nicodemus in an earlier situation. But these are both friends of Jesus. We've put wealthy rulers. When I say rulers here, I just mean that they were members of the Sanhedrin, and they will take charge of the body, and they'll give him as honorable burial as he could be. Joseph of Arimathea, we'll read this here in a second, begs Pilate for the body of Jesus. Why would a friend want the body? Make sure that the place that this happened, Calvaria in the Latin, Golgotha in the Hebrew, place of the skull, one way or the other. I would imagine, based on what we've just read, that a lot of these bodies were disintegrated and they were just tossed over the hill. People, when they say place of the skull, it's debated, did the hill look like a skull? Were there a million skulls laying there? Well, to think that somebody that you knew had been just sort of heaved over the side of the hill and you could see their skull there would have not been appealing to any of us. We bury people today, right? We want, even after that person passes away, we want them to be handled with the utmost respect. And I'm thinking about, Kyle McKnight at Crab Orchard, who that's his job. And there are people that have that job. Ethan Sperlin in town, James David Sperlin, Lancaster, all these people have that job. Well, this is a sad time. And you want somebody that's going to handle that body respectfully. And that's the role that Joseph of Arimathea will play right here. We'll see in John that he was a disciple of Jesus. I use the word secret here. Nicodemus also comes to Jesus at night. Why were both of these men not necessarily waving a flag that said, I am a disciple of Christ? Yes. They would have been thrown out. That would have been the end of their position, as it were, as a leader of the Sanhedrin. Maybe. Perhaps so. So we'll read, Joseph prepares the body of Jesus. He wraps it in a clean linen cloth, lays it in his own new tomb. Now, this is something that is different for us than for them. Almost everybody that you know here that's buried, not a cremation, but if they're buried, there is a hole dug in the ground. Now, why might it be less likely to dig a hole in the ground in, say, Israel than here? It's all rock. It's not the smooth, the smooth dirt or whatever that we might have. And so tombs were very common back then. Now, today, a lot of holes are dug with machinery, but it was not uncommon. And you see vaults in cemeteries in Stanford and Lancaster and everywhere else that when the weather was bad or when it was icy or when the ground was frozen, if you died on December 20th, you'd be stored in the vault until spring came and it thawed and you were able to dig that spot there. But Jesus is going to be laid in Joseph's new tomb. Nicodemus will assist him. He too is a ruler of the Sanhedrin. And at one time we read that he defended Jesus before the council. All of this, the prophecy of Isaiah 53 and verse 9 says they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. So he's hanged with maybe the worst people, but he's buried in a very nice and pleasant tomb. Finally, this gets us to the seventh day, and I promise we're getting to scripture readings here in just a second. But we've talked about the last week of Jesus's life, and that sixth day was a long one. I think we've been on it for 2 months now, but this is the seventh day. And on the seventh day, the Sabbath day, from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, body of Jesus will lay in this tomb. Matthew alone records the fears of the Jewish rulers regarding the body of Jesus, but fearing the disciples would steal the body and then claim he had risen, rulers asked Pilate for a guard at the tomb. So even though Jesus is dead, it doesn't seem like the situation is done. We'll put it that way. There's still tension. There's still nervousness. There's still conflict, whatever word you want to see right there. So before we get into what we're going to be looking tonight, Matthew chapter 27, anybody have questions or comments about what we've said so far? All right. So it's Matthew chapter 27. We'll start here because, again, this is the only place when we look at the Gospels, the four Gospels, this is the only one that talks about a guard being set. So let's look at, yeah. Right. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Well, and a pretty visible deflation. You know, if somebody, I was just finished reading a book about Captain Cook and exploration in the 1700s, and they would go on these trips, these explorations. They'd be gone for 3 years or 4 years, and nobody knew, and word would maybe come back eventually that so-and-so had died, but you don't really have like real proof. But this would have been very real proof. Jesus was a recognizable person to these people, and you would have seen him die right there. So I think you're right, Dad, on that this sort of deflating sense here. Lucille, do you care to read this for us? This is Matthew 27, verses 62 through 66. All right. So we got a couple things that I want to talk about right here. And I want us to consider why this takes place. But what claim of Jesus do the chief priests and the Pharisees remind Pilate of after he'd been buried? They come to him and they say, what? It's like, well, the way we would say it, well, in John chapter 2, he said, but it's sort of this, well, back a while back, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, whenever it would have been, he had said that he would destroy this and in 3 days bring it back. Now, I know that's quoted in John chapter 2, which is a lengthy time period. I don't doubt that Jesus probably said that multiple times. I doubt that was just a one-time only comment, but whether he did or not, they remembered it and they say, he has said this. So they make a request of Pilate. They ask Pilate to do what? They said, we need a guard placed right here. And who were the chief priests and the Pharisees concerned about? The disciples. They had this, what was their worry with regards to the disciples? So the concern here is they'll steal this body. And he said, I'll be resurrected. And so they'll go and they'll steal this body and they'll kind of shove it over here in the corner. And they'll say, oh, he was resurrected. He's not here. He'd be resurrected. Well, I don't know I wonder what Pilate thought about all of this.
I think Pilate was still kind of shook up with his wife's dreams and everything else. I'm sure he was still kind of not sure what was going on.
Right.
And I think too, God's hand is behind this because if they didn't put the guard, they had to steal the tomb, it'd been a whole lot easier for the Pharisees to say what the disciples said.
Sure. Sure.
But when Pilate puts his seal on that tomb and sets these guards, that's no little trivial thing.
Well, he says you have a guard. Go see to it as you see fit. And when he says you have a guard, it's his own soldiers, but he's sort of handing it over to them and say, if you need them, if you want them both standing here, you want them in the front, whatever, you handle that however you see fit. I think I just stole the answer from the question I was about to ask. But how did Pilate respond? He gave them his approval for that. Again, remember, like Ben said, Pilate's sort of he's on the outside of all of this, but he's kind of got tossed into the middle of all this. And again, as we said at the beginning, his job is to keep the peace in the community. And if this person rises up, or if we got people stealing bodies out of the grave, that's just more chaos in the community that he would have to deal with. All right, a little further. Jesus is taken down from the cross late Friday afternoon before sunset, and he's laid into this tomb. You lay in the tomb on Saturday. And early Sunday morning, the first day of the week, and left right there. And that's what we'll look at a bit more in just a second.
There's a pretty good movie called Rhythm that it's not about an accident like that, but it really helps you see some of the insight. It gives you some pictures of their life and stuff with these guards, and the one that was over it, and their investigation trying to find the body of Jesus. It's a pretty good movie. It makes me think a lot of something.
So let's talk about the guards that have been placed here for just a second. These are Roman guards. The one Roman centurion at the foot of the cross said what about Jesus? Surely this was the Son of God. I suspect there were probably others that kind of thought something similar, but we have no idea who these guards would have been. But their job was to do what in this tomb case? Guard the tomb. All right. This is their job is to make sure nothing happens at the tomb. It could have been a tomb with one dead body, with 1 million dead bodies. It could have been a tomb that was holding $10 million worth of gold. Their job was to do what? To guard that. And so anything that happens, anybody that tries to push through, what will they have to do in response? This is my job. So I have no idea what the guards thought about Jesus or any of this, but I do know that in this military sense, they've got to be right there. They've got to be completely focused on the job, because if they fail at this job, what might happen to them? They may be put to death there. And so who cares who this Jesus is or what's about to happen? My job is to make sure the tomb isn't. Josh. Sure. Absolutely. And from my knowledge of that, Josh, not just anybody gets to guard that, right? That's you have to earn that right to be able to do that. And I suspect that these were not just novices that they put in front of here as well. These were probably people, if you're expecting trouble, maybe you put people that you trust a little bit more. Let's go to Luke 23 right here. This is Luke 23. Just a real short reading. Linda Denham, do you care to read Luke 23, verses 55 and 56? So the only way I'm trying to teach this, and it feels like we're jumping around just a little bit on the dates, but I'm trying to get different scriptural places right here. But these women at the tomb, and what Linda just read, that Luke states that some women observed where Jesus's body was laid, and they returned to their homes to prepare spices and ointments for the body, and then they'll rest on the Sabbath day. So we've kind of went back just a little bit here, but this is right after Jesus' body has been taken down. What would be the purpose of these, as the Bible says, spices and ointments? I don't know enough about embalming to say much about it, but I know that one of the things is for scent and smell, and this would have been something that they would have done. It would have been, as we said just a moment ago, an honorable thing to do as well. But notice they run home to prepare it, but then they have to do what? They had to wait. They had to rest there on the Sabbath day. And so early the first day of the week after Jesus' crucifixion and burial, they come to the tomb, bring the sweet spices to anoint the body. And as they were wondering who would roll away the heavy stone at the entrance of the tomb for them, they discovered the stone already rolled away, and they discover that Jesus' body was gone. Now let's think about this for just a second. As they're walking to the tomb, we read here in this fourth bullet point, they're wondering who would roll away the heavy stone. Is this a fair wondering to have thought of? Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if they know that there's a guard here or not, but the guard for these women is probably the least of their concerns. This heavy stone that's there is something that would be a bigger concern. A couple weeks ago, me and Mom and Dad and Will, Dad had cut a tree. They'd cut a tree down, and he was chainsawing it, and we're loading all this, and he said, roll that tree, and it's about, I don't know, it's about 2/3 the length of this pew. He said, roll it forward. Well, I'm not the strongest person in the world, but I'm fairly strong, and I go to push that, and it took a lot of oomph to get that. Well, imagine being much smaller and a big stone that's going to be in front of a tomb, and your concern is, I would like to anoint this body, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to. It's one of those things you're like, once you got this good plan, but on your way, you're like, I don't know if it's going to work out or not. And so despite the fact that the tomb has been sealed and a watch had been placed to guard it, they discovered the stone had already been rolled away. Let's go to John chapter 20. Again, like I said, we're jumping around to a few different things. But John chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Don, do you care to read these two, sir?
Now, the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not have a grave laid.
So, actually, we can go a little bit further. John 20. Dad, you could have read verses 3 through 10.
Peter therefore went out and the other disciples going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloth lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, followed him, went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloth lying there, and a handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloth, but both together and placed by his feet. And the other disciple came to the tomb first, went in also. He saw and believed. Whereas yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So the disciples went away again to their own home.
All right. So, a few questions. They're kind of small. I'll squeeze them all on here. But who sees the tomb first? Mary Magdalene. And so we see she's out ahead, but she's not the only person that's in this crew. The tomb. I suspect an empty tomb when they went up there. No matter what we read in those verses right there, they really didn't understand. When you go to visit the grave, you're not expecting an empty grave to be right there. Last night, Will and I went up to the Hopkins family cemetery, and there are stones and graves all over the place. And a lot of those have been there 100 years longer than when I was born. But the most shocking thing in the world would be to go over there and see one of those graves open and somebody would have come out of it. I know what I'm going to see when I get there. Well, their concern is we know that Jesus is going to be in the tomb. We're going to have to figure out a way to sort of get in there. This would have been the least likely thing that they would have seen. So they tell Peter and John that the tomb was empty. Upon this news, how did the two apostles then approach the tomb? I guess that's true. We're reading John chapter 20 right here. So if Peter had written the gospel, maybe it would have, they might have said, I tripped on, whatever. But they run to it. Why? Anxious? Sure. So they go, which one gets there first, Ben? John gets there first. When he arrives at the tomb, John looks in and sees what? Let's look at verses 3-5. If you've got your Bible, I don't want to go back to what we just read. But John looks in and describe what he sees. He sees the linen clothes laying there, right there, which doesn't go in. It would have been odd to have seen these clothes laying there, I think.
I don't know where I read it, and I don't know how true or accurate. In my studies over the years, I was reading about this. One of the things that said that when I was looking into why it was talking about the face handkerchief folded neatly set to the side, was that said that in those days when carpenters would finish a job, they would fold their cloth a certain way to let the next guy know, okay, I'm done. You can come take care of this part for me. And they said that was part of the reason for Jesus folding that cloth. Some of his disciples would immediately see and recognize Jesus saying, my part's through. Now you can be alone.
Could be the case right there. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. Why do you think he didn't go in? Shot? Afraid? Any other? Tired? Breathing heavy from having ran all the way there. It would have been, how many of you have ever watched a scary movie and the whole time you're like, don't go in there, don't go in there, don't go. And they do what every time? They go in, then something awful happens right then and there. Like, we can relate to this in that. I don't know. I can put myself in his shoes. I don't know why he did or he didn't go in, but he does not. So Peter ends up being the one that goes goes into the tomb, and he sees the linen clothes that we said, but he sees what other item? This is what Ben was talking about there as well. What else does he see besides sort of the robe, the clothes, whatever you want to say? Sort of there you go. In verse, the what? The face cloth. Very good. And it was, I asked the question, how is it discarded? But that's probably not the right word. When I think of discarded, I think throw it, toss it over in the corner or whatever. But what was done with it? It was folded in. So this is clearly not a rushed action. When the house is burning down, you're not going to fold up the clothes real quick before you get out. This was clearly a sort. This is something that's happening in, I guess, real time, but it's also, there's not a rush about that as well. Hopefully, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but this is what Ben was kind of talking about a little bit ago. But the wrapped and rolled grave clothes indicates that there was care and not haste, not speed in removing them. Proof that the body of Jesus was not stolen. If it was stolen, most people, when they rob a house, they're not going to, like I said, fold up all the laundry while they're in there as well with it. Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. And just a little bit further with that, but we see then in what we read, what Dad read a second ago, that the grave clothes convinces John of the resurrection of Jesus. I don't know that Peter needed convinced, but John maybe did need convinced. John 20 and verse 8 says that it caused John. What does it say right there? He saw and believed, right? Well, when we talk about salvation, we talk about becoming a Christian, we talk sometimes about steps of salvation. Well, what's the first thing for us in the steps of salvation? We have to hear, right? And then what's next? Believe. Nobody's going to believe before they hear, right? You got to know what you're hearing. Well, in a sense, we're repeating the same thing that John experienced right here, that John saw and he believed. And I don't fault him for that. I suspect John probably thought he was going to a tomb to probably do some physical labor, maybe to rearrange, spices or whatever it might would be. He was in for a shock when he got there. We see when he got there, he was shocked by that. And so when he gets there, what he experiences was certainly something that would have been, I guess, unexpected. We're going to stop there. I know we don't call that an appearance because Jesus is not there, so we can't count that as an appearance. But Jesus will make several appearances, and over the next couple of times that we look at this lesson, we'll look at who he appears to. First to Mary Magdalene, and then to other women and some other folks along the way. But we'll talk about that as we go forward. But we'll stop right there. Anybody have questions or comments? I feel like I talked more tonight. I apologize. Yes.
I don't know. I can't comprehend how the disciples walking with Jesus, being with Jesus, still don't know.
Yeah.
It's just not for our minds to comprehend.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? All right. Thank you.